What if the maps you trust to guide you were designed to mislead? For centuries, cartography wasn't just about accuracy, it was about power. Picture a medieval ruler unrolling a lavish parchment, tracing coastlines that didn't exist, or pointing to islands that were pure fiction. These weren't mistakes, they were deliberate lies, crafted to intimidate rivals, justify invasions, and rewrite the very boundaries of the known world. Maps became weapons, wielded by empires to shape reality itself. Think about that for a moment. A mapmaker's pen could erase entire cultures or invent territories ripe for conquest. Some maps exaggerated the size of a kingdom to make it seem invincible. Others left blank spaces labeled, "Here be dragons," to dissuade competitors. The most powerful empires didn't just control land, they controlled perception. And in an age when few could verify what lay beyond the horizon, a well-placed lie on parchment could alter the course of history. So why did mapmakers deceive, and who benefited? This is the story of how cartography fueled empires, from the medieval monks who drew fantastical beasts in the margins to the kings who used those same maps to claim dominion over oceans they'd never sailed. We'll uncover the hidden agendas behind these distortions, revealing how a simple piece of parchment could decide the fate of nations. By the time we're done, you'll see old maps not as relics of the past, but as battlefields where ink and imagination clashed, and the winners wrote the rules. The question is, who were they really fooling? Take the Herford Mapa Mundi, a sprawling medieval map drawn on calfskin in the late 13th century. At first glance, it looks like a chaotic mix of cities, biblical scenes, and mythical creatures, but every misplaced mountain and invented island served a purpose. Jerusalem sits dead center, not because it was geographically accurate, but because the church wanted to cement its spiritual authority. Beyond the Holy Land, the map bulges with exaggerated European kingdoms while shrinking Africa into an afterthought. This wasn't ignorance, it was propaganda. Then there's the Vineland map, a controversial parchment that supposedly showed Norse settlements in North America centuries before Columbus. For decades, historians debated its authenticity, but the real question was why anyone would forge it. The answer: to rewrite history in favor of European explorers, erasing indigenous presence and justifying colonial claims. Even if the map was a fake, its intent was painfully real, to legitimize ownership of lands that weren't theirs to claim. But perhaps the most brazen lies came from the age of exploration, when rival empires like Spain and Portugal raced to carve up the globe. Treaty negotiations hinged on maps that conveniently shifted islands into one kingdom's sphere or another. A single stroke of a cartographer's pen could hand a gold-rich coastline to a king who'd never set foot there. These weren't tools for navigation, they were chess pieces in a high-stakes game of empire, and the losers, those who didn't have a say in the drawing, entire civilizations reduced to blank spaces or monsters in the margins. What's chilling is how effective these deceptions were. Without satellites or fact-checkers, a map's authority went unchallenged for generations. A ruler could point to a fabricated river and say, "This has always been ours," and who could prove otherwise? Maps didn't just reflect power, they created it, and in the hands of empires they became the ultimate silent conquerors. Those blank spaces on old maps weren't just empty patches, they were invitations to lie. When a cartographer wrote terra incognita across an uncharted region, it wasn't a confession of ignorance, it was a calculated move. These voids became canvases for empire-building fantasies, where rulers could project whatever served their ambitions. Monsters lurking in the margins that kept rival ships from sailing too close, rumors of cities paved with gold that lured investors to fund risky expeditions. Every blank space was a question mark, and empires wrote the answers in ink. Take the case of the island of California, a myth that persisted on maps for over 200 years. Despite explorers proving California was part of the mainland, cartographers kept drawing it as an island because separating it made the territory seem more exotic, more conquerable. The lie outlived the truth because it served a purpose: to make the unknown feel ripe for taking. Then there were the phantom islands, like High Brassel or Friesland, which appeared on maps for centuries despite no sailor ever finding them. Some historians believe these were deliberate fictions, planted to confuse competing empires. If a rival wasted time chasing an island that didn't exist, your own ships could claim the real prizes. Other times, blank spaces were labeled with warnings like "Here dwell cannibals" or "Sea of Darkness," not because anyone had proof, but because fear was a cheaper way to control territory than armies. The most insidious trick, turning blank spaces into legal arguments. When European powers divided the New World in treaties like Tordesillas, they relied on maps with vast, uncharted regions labeled as disputed or open. This let them carve up continents they'd never seen, handing imaginary lines to kings like property deeds. The people already living there, their presence was erased with a stroke of the pen. Maps didn't just hide the truth, they invented a new one where empty space meant free for the taking. What's haunting is how these tactics still echo today. Modern borders, resource claims, even satellite imagery debates all trace back to this same game of controlling perception. Back then, they used sea monsters and gold myths. Now the tools are subtler, but the goal remains. Whoever controls the map controls the story. And as history shows, the stories we believe often matter more than the facts. Even the shape of the world wasn't safe from manipulation. Medieval TO maps didn't just depict geography, they preached theology. Picture a perfect circle split into 3 slices by a T-shaped cross. Asia perched above, Europe and Africa below, with Jerusalem sitting precisely where the lines intersected. This wasn't cartography, it was a sermon in ink. By forcing the Earth's messy reality into this holy geometry, mapmakers sent a clear message. The world wasn't just ruled by kings, but ordained by God. Take the Ebstorf map, a massive 13th century masterpiece painted on 30 goatskins. At its center, Christ's head, hands, and feet extended beyond the edges of the world, literally framing creation within his body. Rivers became veins, cities nestled in his palms, and the Garden of Eden glowed at the top like a crown. Every mountain and sea was drawn not for accuracy, but as proof of divine order. When crusaders unrolled maps like these in war councils, they weren't just planning routes, they were invoking heaven's blessing for conquest. The church's fingerprints were everywhere. Southern maps often placed paradise at the top, forcing viewers to literally look up toward salvation while relegating Africa to the bottom, steeped in shadow. Dangerous seas were labeled with Jonah's whale or Leviathan, turning navigation hazards into moral lessons. Even wind directions took on spiritual meaning. Easterly breezes might be marked from the breath of God. These weren't helpful legends, they were psychological weapons. Sailors who believed storms were divine punishment would think twice about sailing beyond sanctioned routes. But the real power move was how these maps justified empire. By depicting non-Christian lands as empty or monstrous, like the Herford maps, Blemie tribe with faces on their chests, cartographers dehumanized entire cultures. If foreign shores were inhabited by subhuman creatures or cursed descendants of Cain, then conquering them wasn't cruelty, it was crusade. The Vatican's mapmakers knew exactly what they were doing when they drew cannibals in the Americas or dog-headed men in India centuries before explorers arrived. Fabricate the myth first, and the invasion writes itself. What's startling is how these distortions outlived their creators. Long after navigators proved the world was round and vast, the idea of Jerusalem as Earth's navel persisted in diplomacy. Treaties cited these maps to claim God-given rights to land, and colonial charters quoted their margins as legal precedent. When faith and cartography merged, the result wasn't just bad geography. It was a blueprint for rewriting reality in the name of dominion. The ink may have faded, but the mindset lingered. If you control how people see the world, you control the world itself. Imagine sailing into a port marked as the only safe haven for miles, only to discover the map had hidden a dozen better harbors nearby. This wasn't just cartographic trickery, it was economic warfare. When Venetian merchants controlled the spice trade, their maps didn't just guide ships, they herded them like sheep into profitable lanes. Coastlines were redrawn to make rival routes appear longer. Storms were over-exaggerated near competitors' ports, and friendly cities suddenly vanished from parchment altogether. The goal, to make their own trade hubs seem like the only logical stops, forcing merchants to pay their tariffs or risk phantom perils. The Portuguese took this game to new heights. Their famed Padrão Real, the master map kept under lock and key in Lisbon, wasn't just a navigational tool, it was a state secret. Only a handful of sanctioned cartographers were allowed to copy it, and every version was deliberately altered. Some showed Africa's coastline veering wildly eastward, steering rival ships into dead ends. Others placed non-existent shoals near Indian ports, discouraging competitors from docking. Even latitude lines were fudged. A few degrees shift could send a Spanish galleon hundreds of miles off course, wasting precious months and silver. But the real genius was in what these maps left out. By erasing entire stretches of the Arabian coast or shrinking the Malay Peninsula, cartographers made it seem like Portuguese-controlled Goa was the sole gateway to the east. Merchants who might have sought alternatives found themselves funneled into a single, taxable choke point, and if a Dutch trader somehow stumbled upon an unmarked route, the next edition of the map would label those waters swarming with pirates or cursed by storms. Fear, after all, was cheaper than fortresses. The consequences rippled across continents. When the Ottomans tried to break Venice's monopoly by offering safer overland routes, the Venetians simply redrew the Alps as impassable walls and the Danube as a pirate-infested nightmare. Suddenly, caravan costs proved sea travel was cheaper, conveniently ignoring that Venetian maps had invented those costs in the first place. Even local economies were reshaped by these lies. A port city left off the maps might wither into obscurity, while a phantom island like Bus could attract decades of futile expeditions, draining rivals' resources. What's chilling is how these tactics mirror modern monopolies. Today's algorithms might hide competitors' products or manipulate search results, but the playbook hasn't changed. Control the map, control the flow of wealth, and back then, with no fact-checkers or satellites, a single inked lie could reroute fortunes for centuries. The spices may have faded from those old parchment folds, but the stains of deception, those linger. The legend of Eldorado didn't start as a place at all, it began as a person. Deep in the Andes, the Muisca people performed a ritual where their leader, covered in gold dust, would dive into Lake Guatavita as an offering to the gods. But when Spanish conquistadors heard fragments of this story, their greed transformed it into something far more dangerous, a cartographic fantasy. Mapmakers, eager to please their patrons, began sketching a golden city deep in the jungle, its streets paved with treasure. Never mind that no such city existed. The maps made it real enough to justify bloodshed. What's chilling is how deliberately these lies were crafted. Spanish cartographers like Juan de la Cosa didn't just mark Eldorado vaguely, they placed it precisely, shifting its location with each new addition. One year, it lurked in the mountains of Colombia. The next, it had moved to the Amazon basin. This wasn't a mistake, it was bait. Each revision sent fresh waves of conquistadors into the interior, too busy chasing phantom gold to notice the real riches being extracted under their noses. Enslaved indigenous labor, stolen emerald mines, and fertile land seized for plantations. The maps also served as psychological weapons. By depicting South America's interior as a glittering prize, they turned conquest into a fever dream. Explorers like Gonzalo Pizarro bankrupted themselves on doomed expeditions, convinced the next ridge would reveal golden spires. When they found nothing, the maps absorbed the blame, not the empire's cruelty. The cartographers must have erred, they'd say, while indigenous guides who'd warned them all along were branded as liars or worse. But the most insidious twist, Eldorado eventually became real not as a city, but as a system. The myth justified networks of forced labor to mine actual gold, while the legend itself distracted Europe from the atrocities. Maps labeled rivers with names like Rio de Oro to keep the fantasy alive, even as the rivers ran red. Centuries later, we still see the scars, ecosystems gutted by colonial mines, cultures erased for a lie inked onto parchment. The tragedy isn't just that Eldorado was fiction, it's how thoroughly fiction can rewrite history, and the legacy lingers. Modern treasure hunters still comb satellite images for lost golden cities, proving how hard it is to unsee a lie once it's stamped on a map. The real Eldorado was never a place, it was a trick, one that convinced men to trade humanity for an illusion, all because someone with a quill dared to draw it. Look closely at the swirling ink of the Carta Marina, and you'll spot a monstrous lobster dragging sailors to their doom. Nearby, a serpent with the face of a boar chokes a ship in its coils. These weren't just flights of fancy, they were border patrols in disguise. When Scandinavian mapmakers populated their waters with horrors, they weren't documenting nature, they were enforcing a monopoly. Fear, after all, was the cheapest navy money could buy. The genius lay in the details. Notice how the most terrifying beasts cluster around Iceland and Greenland, prime fishing grounds for Basque and English crews. A ship's captain glancing at this map would think twice before venturing into waters infested by tentacled horrors. Meanwhile, Scandinavian fishermen sailed those same routes unbothered, their holds filling with cod while rivals stayed paralyzed by parchment-borne nightmares. It was psychological warfare with a quill, but the Carta Marina was just one tactic in a centuries-long strategy. Portuguese maps labeled African coastlines with Sea of Darkness warnings to keep competitors from following their trade winds. Venetian charts marked rival ports with skulls and whirlpools, steering merchants toward their own harbors. Even the Bible got weaponized. Some maps quoted psalms about leviathans lurking in Dutch waters, turning scripture into a trade barrier. The irony, many sea monsters bore uncanny resemblance to real threats, just exaggerated for effect. Giant squids became multi-armed demons. Rare whale sightings morphed into island-sized beasts. By anchoring their lies in slivers of truth, cartographers made the fiction stick. A sailor who'd glimpsed a breaching sperm whale might easily believe the rest, especially when kings and clergy backed the map's authority. What's fascinating is how these myths outlived their creators. Long after navigators proved the North Atlantic safe, insurers still charged higher rates for routes once marked, "Here be monsters." The specter of those inked beasts lingered in maritime law, trade policies, even exploration budgets, proof that a well-placed lie on parchment could shape economics for generations. Today's equivalent might be a rumor of pirates tanking a stock or a fake news story diverting tourism. The tools change, but the game remains. Control the narrative, control the profit. And let's not forget who paid the price. Indigenous Greenlanders watched as their ancestral waters were branded monster-infested by outsiders who'd never sailed them. West African fishermen found their catch dwindling as European maps scared away potential trade partners. The sea monsters didn't just guard territory, they erased entire maritime cultures, painting local knowledge as superstition while the real superstition was inked in gilded atlases. So the next time you see a whimsical sea serpent on an old map, don't just admire the art, ask who benefited from that fear and who vanished beneath its waves. Because the greatest trick these cartographers ever pulled wasn't convincing the world monsters existed, it was convincing us they were the only ones who could draw the line between myth and reality. A blank space on a map could be just as powerful as a lie. When Ottoman cartographers sketched the world, they didn't just draw their empire in lavish detail, they shrank their rivals into insignificance. Vienna, a city that had resisted their sieges, might appear as a mere dot, while Istanbul sprawled across the parchment in exaggerated grandeur. This wasn't a matter of scale or perspective, it was visual propaganda. By minimizing European cities, the Ottomans didn't just claim territory, they rewrote the balance of power in ink. The Ming dynasty took this tactic even further. Their maps of East Asia often left Japan off entirely, as if the islands had vanished into the sea. This wasn't ignorance. Chinese navigators had traded with Japan for centuries. It was a calculated snub, a way to assert dominance without firing a single arrow. Why acknowledge a rival when you could simply erase them? To the Ming court, a map wasn't a reflection of reality. It was a declaration of how reality should be. But the most insidious omissions targeted not just enemies but entire peoples. When European maps labeled the Americas as empty or unclaimed, they weren't describing wilderness, they were justifying theft. Indigenous cities like Tenochtitlan, larger than any in Europe at the time, vanished from Spanish maps, replaced by blank spaces marked to be explored. The message was clear: land without Christian rulers was land without history, ripe for the taking. These silences spoke volumes. A map that left out a kingdom's allies could isolate them diplomatically. A chart that ignored a rival's ports could strangle their trade. And when multiple empires adopted the same omissions, the lies hardened into accepted truth. After centuries of seeing Japan absent from Chinese maps, even Japanese merchants sometimes referred to their homeland as the floating islands, internalizing the erasure. What's haunting is how these tactics persist. Modern borders still follow lines drawn by conquerors who erased inconvenient populations with a penstroke. Satellite imagery can't undo centuries of cartographic gaslighting. The moment we believe a place is empty, we start treating it that way. The greatest power isn't just controlling what's on the map. It's deciding what gets left off. The ink on the Treaty of Tordesillas might have dried in 1494, but its lies still stain modern borders. When Pope Alexander VI drew a line down the Atlantic, splitting the globe between Spain and Portugal, he wasn't just dividing territory, he was erasing civilizations. The parchment showed the New World as a blank slate, ignoring the millions already living there because empty land was easier to steal. This wasn't geography, it was legal alchemy, turning conquest into charity with a stroke of the pen. British mapmakers perfected this trick centuries later. Their charts of Africa labeled vast regions as terra nullius, nobody's land, despite thriving kingdoms like Benin and Ashanti. By the time explorers like Livingstone arrived, the myths were already printed. Maps showed dark continents awaiting enlightenment, not complex societies with their own maps and borders. The cartographer's lie became the colonizer's excuse. If the land wasn't marked as civilized, taking it wasn't theft, it was salvation. France played the same game in Southeast Asia. Vietnamese coasts that had bustled with trade for millennia suddenly appeared on French maps as untamed shores in need of order. Rivers snaked differently on these charts, bending to justify new colonial boundaries that split ethnic groups in half. The message was clear: what France drew, France could own, and if locals protested, the maps themselves became evidence of their backwardness. After all, how could people who didn't even use European cartography understand land rights? But the most insidious part wasn't the lies themselves. It was how they infected law books. When the Spanish cited their Tordesillas map in court battles over the Andes, or the British used their empty Africa charts to seize farmland, they weren't just referencing paper. They were invoking an entire system that treated ink as truth. Indigenous leaders who brought their own maps, like the Incas' knotted quippus or Polynesian stick charts, were dismissed as primitive. The winners didn't just write history, they drew it, then declared their version the only one that counted. What's chilling is how these tactics evolved. The same arguments used to justify the scramble for Africa resurfaced in 20th century oil disputes, where companies redrew desert borders to claim drilling rights. Modern satellite imagery can't undo centuries of cartographic brainwashing. The moment we believe a place is unmapped, we start treating it as unowned. The real power of these old maps wasn't in their lines, but in their silence. Because when you convince the world that certain people don't exist on paper, it's only a matter of time before they're erased from the ground. The Mercator projection wasn't just a tool for navigation, it was a funhouse mirror for the world. When Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator unveiled his famous map in 1569, sailors cheered. Finally, a chart where straight lines on paper matched true compass bearings at sea. But that mathematical convenience came with a hidden cost. Landmasses near the poles stretched grotesquely out of proportion, while equatorial regions shrank. Greenland ballooned to appear larger than Africa, though in reality it's 14 times smaller. Europe, modest in true size, sprawled center stage like the protagonist of the planet. This wasn't an accident, it was a reflection of who held the pen. Consider the psychological impact. For centuries, schoolchildren learned geography from maps where Britain looked as vast as India, and Scandinavia rivaled the entire African continent. When colonial administrators pointed to these distorted landmasses, the message was subconscious but undeniable. This is your empire, vast and dominant. The Mercator map didn't just help ships sail straight, it helped empires think big. And because the distortion grew gradually from equator to poles, most viewers never noticed the lie. Like a slow-boiling frog, the world absorbed this skewed perspective as fact. The most insidious part, the projection's bias, outlived the empires it served. Long after ships switched to GPS, classrooms kept hanging Mercator maps, cementing generations of subconscious bias. Africa, a continent 3 times larger than Europe, continued to appear dwarfed by Greenland's bloated silhouette. This visual hierarchy seeped into everything from foreign aid debates to Hollywood's portrayal of exotic locales. When people imagine Africa as small and distant rather than the sprawling, diverse reality, that's Mercator's ghost whispering in their ear. But here's the twist: Mercator himself might be horrified. His original goal was nautical accuracy, not geopolitical propaganda. The distortion was a mathematical necessity for sailors, not a deliberate slight. Yet once the map left his workshop, it took on a life of its own. Kings and educators cherry-picked its most flattering angles, ignoring alternatives like the Peters projection that showed true landmass sizes. The Mercator became the standard, not because it was fair, but because it flattered the powers that funded its printing. What's revealing is how hard the lie was to dislodge. When Boston schools switched to equal area maps in the 1980s, parents complained their children couldn't find America anymore because suddenly the U.S. wasn't front and center, inflated like a Thanksgiving Day parade float. Even today, digital maps default to Mercator-like zooms, prioritizing familiar distortions over geographical honesty. The map we think of as neutral was never neutral at all. It was a lens ground to the prescription of empire, and centuries later, we're still squinting through its warped glass. The lesson isn't just about cartography. It's about how easily practical tools become propaganda when left unchallenged. A map made to guide ships ended up steering minds, teaching generations to see dominance where none existed. And that's the real danger of deceptive cartography, not the lies we notice, but the ones we mistake for truth. Locked away in Lisbon's Torre do Tombo, guarded like crown jewels, the Padrão Real wasn't just a map, it was the Portuguese Empire's beating heart. Imagine a single master parchment, updated after every voyage with stolen knowledge from Arab navigators, bribed Venetian spies, and captive pilots from Calicut. This wasn't geography, it was a living weapon. Only 5 trusted cartographers were allowed to copy it, and even then they worked in separate rooms, each given fragments of the truth. The result, a web of deliberate lies woven into every duplicate. Coastlines bent the wrong way, safe harbors vanished, phantom reefs sprouted where rival ships might sail. One infamous forgery sent Spanish caravels straight into the doldrums, their crews starving as they waited for winds that the Portuguese knew would never come. Another showed the Indian Ocean narrower by 1,000 miles, tricking Dutch merchants into loading half the supplies they'd need. The genius wasn't just in the deception, it was in the asymmetry. While competitors floundered with false charts, Portuguese captains followed the real Padrão straight to the richest ports, their holds bursting with pepper and silk long before rivals even spotted land. But the most cunning trick was how they weaponized time. When Vasco da Gama returned from India, his logbooks described monsoon patterns that could shave months off the journey. That intelligence went straight into the Padrão, but only for Lisbon's eyes. Public maps still showed the old, slower routes, forcing competitors to waste precious seasons. By the time the Dutch or English realized they'd been duped, Portuguese forts already guarded every strategic cove. The cost of failure was brutal. In 1580, a Spanish spy named Lope de Vega managed to bribe a scribe for a partial copy. Within weeks, Lisbon's agents found his body floating in the Tagus, the stolen charts weighted with stones in his pockets. Yet the real tragedy wasn't the spies who died for these maps, it was the cultures they erased. Arab pilots who'd guided Portuguese ships through the Indian Ocean found their knowledge stolen, then scrubbed from history. The Padrão didn't just mislead Europeans, it made entire civilizations' expertise disappear, rewriting the story of exploration as a solo European triumph. What's chilling is how modern this all feels. Today's tech giants guard algorithms like the Padrão, while leaking strategic misinformation to competitors. Nations weaponize satellite data just as fiercely as Lisbon hoarded wind charts. The tools have changed, but the game remains. Control the map, control the future. And as history shows, the winners aren't always those with the best information, just those who guard it closest and fake it best. When European settlers arrived in North America, they didn't just bring muskets and Bibles, they brought maps that declared the land empty. Take John Smith's famous 1606 chart of Virginia, where Powhatan villages carefully placed along trade routes were replaced with English names like Jamestown and Henricus. The original inhabitants weren't just ignored, they were overwritten, their presence scrubbed from the parchment to justify a legal fiction, terra nullius, land belonging to no one. This wasn't careless cartography, it was conquest by eraser. The strategy was chillingly effective. In New England, colonial maps labeled Wampanoag fishing grounds as wasteland, making it seem like indigenous people weren't using the territory, when in reality, they'd been sustainably harvesting there for generations. Dutch maps of Manhattan showed Lenape trails fading into dotted lines, then vanishing entirely, as if the island had been waiting for European streets. Even when native settlements appeared, they were often marked with vague terms like Indian camps, denying them the permanence of towns or cities. These weren't neutral descriptions, they were legal loopholes. Under European property law, only improved land, meaning plowed fields or walled towns, could be owned. By erasing indigenous agriculture and architecture, the maps turned thriving communities into squatters on their own soil. But the most insidious tactic wasn't just leaving native lands off the map, it was redrawing their borders to sow division. Spanish chartmakers in California deliberately misaligned mission boundaries with Chumash tribal lands, forcing rival bands into conflict over shrinking resources. British maps of the Ohio Valley chopped up Shawnee hunting grounds with arbitrary lines, pitting tribes against each other in disputes the colonists could then mediate. The goal wasn't accuracy, it was chaos. Fractured peoples were easier to displace, and every disputed territory became an excuse for settlers to step in as neutral administrators. The tragedy deepened when these false borders hardened into law. The infamous Johnson v. Emmentosh case in 1823 saw the U.S. Supreme Court cite early colonial maps as proof that America had been discovered empty, ignoring centuries of indigenous cartography like the Micmac star charts or the Cherokee's river clay maps. By treating native nations as features of the landscape rather than sovereign powers, the maps didn't just guide settlers, they scripted their legal arguments for theft. What's haunting is how these cartographic tricks still echo today. Modern pipeline companies cite 19th century, empty land, maps to dispute tribal sovereignty. National parks erase indigenous place names from trail signs, even when those names guided explorers for centuries. The lie wasn't just in the ink, it was in the silence, the deliberate gaps where civilization should have been. Because when you convince people a place has no history, they'll believe it has no owners, and that's how a map becomes a deed written not by those who lived there, but by those who wished they didn't. High Brassel first appeared on maps in the 14th century as a mist-shrouded island west of Ireland, often drawn as a perfect circle split by a river. According to legend, it emerged from the fog only once every 7 years, just long enough to tempt sailors, then vanish. But this wasn't just folklore, it was cartographic catnip. Portuguese and English mapmakers kept High Brassel on their charts for over 500 years, shifting its location with each failed expedition. Some historians believe it was a deliberate decoy, a Celtic myth repurposed to distract rival ships from real fishing grounds or trade routes. After all, why waste gunpowder sinking competitors when you could send them chasing a ghost? Then there was Friesland, a sprawling island that dominated 16th century maps of the North Atlantic. Venetian explorer Niccolò Zeno claimed to have discovered it in the 1300s, describing forests teeming with game and harbors safe from storms. The only problem, Friesland never existed, but its fictional coordinates conveniently placed between Iceland and Greenland became a magnet for explorers. English privateers like Martin Frobisher used it as cover to raid Spanish ships, claiming they were merely searching for Friesland when intercepted. Dutch cartographers, meanwhile, kept the myth alive to justify their own claims to Arctic whaling grounds. The lie was so persistent that when the British Admiralty finally declared Friesland a fiction in the 1800s, some sailors still refused to believe it, convinced their predecessors had simply missed the island in the fog. But perhaps the most brazen phantom was Sandy Island, which appeared on British naval charts near New Caledonia as late as 2012. Labeled with palm trees and shoals, it was even included in scientific databases as a potential research site until an Australian survey ship sailed straight through its supposed coordinates and found nothing but open ocean. The revelation sparked global headlines, but the real scandal was how Sandy Island had slipped through centuries of scrutiny. Some blame a whaler's typo in 1876. Others suspect it was a copyright trap, a fictional landmark mapmakers inserted to catch plagiarists. Either way, its persistence reveals a darker truth. Once a lie enters the cartographic record, it takes more than evidence to kill it. It takes a ship willing to sail into empty water and say, "See, nothing here." These phantom islands weren't just innocent mistakes. They were geopolitical chess pieces. Spain's Santa Maria de la Antigua appeared on maps of the Caribbean just long enough to muddy Portuguese claims. The mythical Isle of Demons off Canada kept French rivals from poaching cod-rich waters. Even Antarctica wasn't safe. Ptolemy's hypothetical Terra Australis haunted maps for centuries, fueling a mad rush to claim a continent that, when finally found, was nothing like the fertile paradise promised. The fictions always served someone: explorers needing investors, kings needing victories, empires needing frontiers. What's haunting is how these cartographic ghosts still shape our world. Modern oil companies have fought legal battles over drilling rights near phantom reefs. Airline pilots occasionally report vanishing islands that match centuries-old myths. And in an age of GPS, we've replaced sea monsters with glitches, but the game remains the same. Control the map, control the story. After all, if you can convince people to risk their lives chasing an island that isn't there, what else can you make them believe? During the tense years leading up to the First World War, British cartographers didn't just map German naval bases, they weaponized them. Take the infamous 1906 Admiralty chart of Wilhelmshaven, where dry docks appeared twice their actual size and surrounding waters bristled with imaginary gun emplacements. These weren't clerical errors, they were fear factories. When Parliament debated naval spending, officials would unfurl these exaggerated maps, pointing to the looming Teutonic threat as justification for more dreadnoughts. The truth, Germany's fleet was still outnumbered 3-1. But accuracy didn't matter when the goal was to turn ink into anxiety. The same playbook resurfaced in the Cold War, with both sides bending maps to fit their nightmares. Soviet atlases routinely shrank the distance between U.S. missile silos and Moscow, making American ICBMs seem minutes from impact. American maps retaliated by coloring entire swaths of Eastern Europe as Soviet-held, erasing nuances like Yugoslavia's neutrality or Polish resistance movements. These distortions weren't meant for generals, they were crafted for schoolrooms and newspapers, where a child tracing a map could internalize the idea that the enemy was always closer, always hungrier than reality suggested. Psychological warfare took stranger turns in World War II. The British Special Operations Executive printed fake French railway maps with misaligned junctions and phantom tunnels, then leaked them to German logistics officers. The result, supply trains crawled through the countryside searching for intersections that didn't exist, while resistance fighters sabotaged the real routes unchallenged. Meanwhile, Nazi propagandists distributed tourist maps of England, marking picturesque villages as military targets, a not-so-subtle nudge to civilians that nowhere was safe. What's chilling is how these tactics blurred the line between deception and delusion. When Japanese forces invaded Burma, their commanders relied on maps that exaggerated the width of rivers, leading to disastrous crossing attempts. Turns out, the maps were British colonial surveys from the 1880s, deliberately distorted to overcharge rice farmers for irrigation permits. The lies had outlived their creators by decades, proving that cartographic propaganda doesn't just manipulate the present, it haunts the future. Modern conflicts still lean on these old tricks. During the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Pentagon briefings flashed maps of chemical weapons facilities, clustered like grapes around Baghdad, later revealed to be schools, hospitals, and even a baby formula factory. The coordinates were accurate, but the labels were fiction. And just like those medieval monks drawing dragons, the goal wasn't to document reality, but to rewrite it. Because in war, the first casualty isn't just truth, it's the map that claims to show it. The Vatican's map room wasn't just an archive, it was a war room. Here, under flickering candlelight, monks like Fra Mauro bent over calfskin parchments, turning geography into gospel. His famous 1459 world map didn't just depict cities and seas, it staged a divine drama. Jerusalem glowed at the center like a beacon, while the edges of the known world faded into shadowy realms marked the dwelling place of demons. Every ink stroke served dual purposes, guiding sailors and saving souls. Notice how the map treats non-Christian lands. The Kingdom of Prester John, a mythical Christian empire, sprawls across Africa in exaggerated detail, while actual African kingdoms like Mali shrink into insignificance. India appears dotted with crosses where no churches stood, and the Garden of Eden isn't just illustrated, it's given precise coordinates. This wasn't cartography, it was recruitment propaganda. A merchant consulting Fra Mauro's map wouldn't just see trade routes, he'd see a world half conquered for Christ, with blank spaces begging for missionaries. The church's genius lay in controlling not just the maps, but their reproduction. Before the printing press, copying a map required weeks of labor by trained scribes, almost always clerics. Want a chart for your voyage? You'd get one flavored with Vatican-approved corrections. Pagan temples vanished from port cities, rivers diverted to avoid sacred sites. Even wind roses pointed preferentially toward Christian lands, as if God himself guided the sails. Some of the most insidious edits targeted the southern hemisphere. Medieval theologians debated whether the antipodes could exist if Christ's salvation reached that far. So church maps either left the bottom half of the world blank or filled it with grotesque, monstrous races like the Cyapods, who shaded themselves with a single giant foot. These weren't harmless myths, they were theological minefields. By depicting uncharted regions as morally suspect, the maps made colonization feel like crusade. Yet the real power move came with the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. When the Pope divided the New World between Spain and Portugal, he didn't use a modern map, he used a modified version of Ptolemy's ancient charts, tweaked to favor Catholic monarchs. The line of demarcation conveniently placed Brazil in Portuguese hands, though no European had yet seen its coast. How Vatican cartographers had adjusted Africa's bulge westward on their master copy, shifting the global partition. A lie in ink became a continent in empire. What's haunting is how these spiritual maps outlived their makers. Jesuit missionaries carried versions to China that showed the Great Wall as a crumbling barrier against Christian light. In the Americas, indigenous codices were burned and replaced with maps where local sacred mountains became stations of the cross. The maps didn't just record landscapes, they overwrote them, turning millennia of belief into footnotes on parchment. Today, we dismiss these distortions as medieval superstition, but the instinct remains. Google Maps still marks disputed borders differently depending on your location. Satellite imagery gets blurred around military bases. Even GPS routes can steer travelers toward sponsored stops. The Vatican's map room may be a museum now, but its lesson endures. Whoever controls the map doesn't just guide journeys. They define reality. When France's revolutionary government unveiled its new national map in 1793, every mountain range and river had become a political statement. The cartographers didn't just draw borders, they weaponized geography itself. The Rhine wasn't merely a river, it was France's natural frontier, a claim stitched into parchment to justify swallowing the Vineland. Across the border, German mapmakers fired back with their own ink, erasing centuries of fractured principalities to paint a unified Deutschland in bold, unbroken color. This wasn't just map-making, it was nation-building with a compass and quill. The French obsession with natural borders reveals how maps could turn geography into destiny. By labeling the Alps and Pyrenees as ancient boundaries, cartographers implied these lines were ordained by nature, not conquest. Never mind that medieval France had spilled beyond the Rhine countless times, or that Basque and Catalan cultures straddled both sides of the Pyrenees. The maps told a cleaner story. France was a geometric masterpiece, its edges carved by divine hands. When Napoleon's armies marched, they carried these maps like holy writ, returning to lands the ink had already claimed. German cartographers played a subtler game. Before Bismarck unified the states in 1871, their maps performed the miracle on paper first. A typical atlas might show 39 independent duchies and kingdoms in one color, labeled Germanic peoples. Rival cultures like the Poles in Prussia or Danes in Schleswig vanished beneath washes of nationalist ink. The message was clear: fragmentation was temporary, unity was inevitable. These maps didn't just guide travelers, they manufactured consensus, turning a Germany from a fuzzy idea into a visual fact before the First Reichstag even convened. But the most potent trick was how these maps rewrote history. French schoolchildren learned geography from charts where Alsace-Lorraine always wore the fleur de lis, ignoring centuries of German rule. Prussian maps of Silesia airbrushed out Slavic place names, replacing them with Teutonic syllables. Every erased village, every straightened border served a purpose: to make the nation seem eternal, its borders timeless. The past became as malleable as wet parchment. The scars of this cartographic nationalism still throb today. Modern Ukraine's struggle against Russian maps that call Crimea always Russian mirrors France's Rhine claims. China's 9-dash line in the South China Sea follows the same playbook: draw first, justify later. Because once a line appears on enough maps, it stops being ink and starts being truth. The real borders weren't in the land, they were in the minds of those who learned to see the world through nationalist lenses. And as history shows, those are the hardest borders of all to erase. The Silk Road wasn't just a highway of goods, it was a labyrinth of lies. Arab cartographers guarded its secrets like alchemists hoarding gold recipes. Some drew oasis towns slightly off true positions, forcing rival caravans to wander into deserts. Others scribbled routes in lemon juice, invisible until held over a flame. The most cunning maps hid entire mountain passes in plain sight, disguising them as decorative flourishes or weaving them into the tails of dragons. These weren't mistakes, they were traps for the greedy. Only merchants who knew the cipher, perhaps a verse from the Quran or a pattern in the border, could decode the real path. Take the legendary Kitab al-Mazalik wa al-Mamalik, a 9th century Persian atlas that claimed to chart every trade route from Baghdad to Beijing. To the untrained eye, it looked meticulous, but traders whispered that its most valuable pages were blank, waiting for trusted hands to fill in the gaps with ink made from crushed lapis lazuli, a pigment so expensive only the wealthiest guilds could afford the key. Even the stars weren't safe from deception. Arab navigators shared false constellations, teaching rivals to steer by the camel's tail, while their own ships followed hidden stars like the merchant's arrow. The stakes were staggering. A single accurate map could collapse the price of silk or pepper by revealing shortcuts. So when Venetian explorer Marco Polo returned from China with tales of paper money and black stones that burned, the Mongols weren't just amused by his ignorance, they were relieved. His wildly inaccurate descriptions of the Pamir Mountains as so high no birds could fly over them kept European rivals trudging through unnecessary detours for generations. The Mongols knew, let the foreigners believe the world is stranger than it is, and they'll never find the real treasure. But the greatest trick wasn't hiding routes, it was inventing dangers. Persian maps of the Taklamakan Desert labeled safe wells as poisoned and marked fertile valleys with skulls. The message, stick to the taxed roads or risk the horrors we've drawn. Silk Road monopolies didn't need walls, they needed whispers. A well-placed rumor about sand ghouls or salt flats that turned men to stone was cheaper than an army and far more effective. What's chilling is how these tactics evolved. When the British East India Company took over the opium trade, they borrowed the same playbook. Their maps of Bengal forgot tributaries where smugglers paddled, while overstating the dangers of independent ports. Today's supply chain monopolies don't use invisible ink. They use algorithms that steer shipments toward preferred hubs. The tools change, but the game remains. Control the map, control the market. And as the Silk Road proves, sometimes the most powerful routes are the ones nobody sees. Marie Tharp's hands traced the contours of the ocean floor, revealing what no one else had dared to see. While male explorers chased glory on the surface, she pieced together sonar data in a cramped office, stitching together a hidden world of ridges and trenches. Her 1957 map of the Atlantic's floor didn't just chart mountains underwater. It proved continents moved, cracking open the myth of fixed, unchanging lands that empires had clung to for centuries. The reaction, her male colleagues called it girl talk. For years, they dismissed her findings as fantasy, even as her work laid the foundation for plate tectonics, one of the most revolutionary scientific theories of the 20th century. Tharp's struggle wasn't unique. Centuries earlier, another woman defied the Cartographic Boys Club, Anna Maria van Sherman, a 17th-century Dutch polymath whose maps of European cities were so precise, scholars assumed they were drawn by men. She signed them with initials to avoid scrutiny. Then there was Phyllis Pearsall, who walked every street of 1930s London to create the first Z Street Atlas, only to have male investors question her hobby. The pattern was clear. When women mapped the world, their truths were treated as trespasses. But here's what makes Tharp's story so explosive. Her maps didn't just challenge scientific dogma, they undermined the very logic of empire. For centuries, rulers had insisted borders were eternal, lands immutable divine gifts to be fought over. Tharp's rippling mid-Atlantic ridge proved the ground beneath their feet was in constant motion. If continents could drift, what did that say about the lines kings drew on parchment? No wonder the establishment resisted. A woman's pen had exposed the fragility of their claims. The irony, Tharp's tools were born from war. The sonar data she used came from military surveys, technology designed to track submarines, not scientific discovery. Yet in her hands, these instruments of conflict became tools of revelation. Her maps didn't just redraw the ocean floor, they redrew humanity's place in the cosmos, showing Earth as a restless, shifting entity. And she did it from a basement office, barred from joining research vessels because women were bad luck at sea. Today, we celebrate Tharp as a pioneer, but her legacy cuts deeper. Every time a satellite reveals a melting glacier or a shifting delta, we're continuing her work, using maps to challenge the stories power tells about itself. Because cartography's greatest lies weren't just about phantom islands or exaggerated borders, they were about who got to define reality. And as Tharp proved, sometimes it takes someone outside the old boys club to show us what's really there. Astrolabes gleamed in the candlelight of royal workshops, their brass faces etched with star charts that could guide a ship across trackless oceans or send it spiraling into oblivion. These intricate devices, often hailed as marvels of medieval science, hid a darker secret. Some bore deliberate errors, their latitude scales skewed by a fraction of a degree, just enough to veer a vessel hundreds of miles off course. Portuguese navigators whispered of the King's Astrolabe, a master instrument kept under guard in Lisbon, its readings flawless while copies distributed to allies contained subtle flaws. A miscalibrated star sight here, an offset azimuth ring there, small deceptions with devastating consequences. The trick wasn't just in the falsification, but in its plausibility. An error of half a degree might be dismissed as ordinary wear or user mistake, especially when sailing unfamiliar seas. But over a month-long voyage, that tiny deviation could divert a Spanish galleon into dead calms or onto reefs marked safe passage on doctored charts. Rival captains would blame poor luck or incompetence, never suspecting the brass instrument in their hands was a saboteur. The most insidious lies aren't shouted, they're whispered in the language of mathematics. Even the design of these tools betrayed their dual purpose. Some Venetian astrolabes featured beautifully engraved backplates showing saints blessing the seas unless held at an angle, revealing hidden etchings of snarling sea monsters along popular trade routes. Others had adjustable plates that could covertly shift celestial measurements, turning a navigator's faithful guide into a rigged compass. The Ottomans took it further, crafting astrolabes with prayer niches that, when opened, exposed tiny mirrors reflecting corrected star tables, a cryptographic cheat sheet for trusted captains. The collateral damage of these deceptions extended far beyond rival empires. Indigenous pilots from Zanzibar to Java, whose knowledge had been pillaged to create these instruments, watched as their hard-won understanding of monsoons and currents was repackaged into tools of exclusion. When a Malay sailor warned Portuguese crews about false readings near the Sunda Strait, his concerns were dismissed as superstition until a fleet loyal to the Dutch vanished there, its officers following a miscalibrated astrolabe straight onto the rocks. The victors wrote it off as tragedy, the survivors knew better. What's haunting is how these tactics persist in modern navigation. GPS jamming, manipulated depth sounders, even AI-generated false charts. The tools have digitized, but the game remains. Control the instruments, control the course, and as history shows, when science becomes a weapon, the first casualty isn't just truth, but those who trust the numbers on the dial. Open your phone and zoom in on the Kashmir region. Depending on whether you're in New Delhi or Islamabad, the borders will shift before your eyes, not because the land moved, but because the code did. Google Maps doesn't show one truth, it shows dozens, each tailored to the laws and biases of the country you're in. This isn't a glitch, it's the modern version of kings redrawing coastlines. Only now, the ink is made of ones and zeros, and the cartographers wear hoodies instead of robes. Take TikTok's geopolitical filters. When users in China scroll through travel videos, the app automatically blurs out landmarks tied to Taiwan's independence movement, like certain memorial halls or flags. The algorithm doesn't just censor, it rebuilds reality in real time, pixel by pixel. Meanwhile, Russian versions of Yandex Maps label Crimea as federal territory, while Ukrainian users see it outlined in the colors of their flag. These aren't neutral platforms, they're battlegrounds where every zoom level is a political act. Even humanitarian efforts aren't immune. After the 2020 Beirut explosion, volunteers rushed to map damaged neighborhoods using OpenStreetMap. But when they tried to mark Hezbollah-controlled areas, their edits vanished not because they were wrong, but because the group's digital allies had bots patrolling the map like medieval scribes erasing rival kingdoms. The same happens in conflict zones from Yemen to Myanmar. First comes the bombs, then the bots, scrubbing evidence of destruction or shifting blame with strategic labels. What's chilling is how these digital lies compound. When Airbnb listings in the West Bank tag settlements as Tel Aviv countryside, or Wikipedia edits alter ancient place names in Armenia, those changes ripple into textbooks, news reports, even court evidence. Modern map fraud doesn't need quills or parchment, just enough people hitting accept on a terms of service agreement they'll never read. The winners still write history, they just outsource the typing to algorithms. Yet there's a twist. While medieval lies took centuries to correct, digital deceptions can unravel in minutes. When Google briefly labeled the Black Sea as Lake Google in 2021, the internet roasted the error into oblivion within hours. Crowdsourced tools like Wikimapia let villagers in the Amazon document illegal logging faster than governments can cover it up. The tools of distortion are now in everyone's hands, and that's why today's power struggles aren't just over who controls the maps, but who controls the code that draws them. The parchment may have turned to pixels, but the fight, that's as old as the first lie ever inked onto a map. Before the first European ships scraped Australia's shores, the Aboriginal peoples had already mapped every waterhole, songline, and sacred site across the continent, not with ink and parchment, but through stories sung across generations. These living maps, passed down for millennia, held truths colonial cartographers couldn't fathom. When British surveyors arrived, they dismissed these intricate mental geographies as primitive, replacing them with blank grids labeled terra nullius. But in the 1970s, something extraordinary happened. Aboriginal elders began translating their ancestral knowledge onto paper, creating the first official Aboriginal land rights maps. One stroke at a time, they reclaimed what the empire had tried to erase. Take the iconic map of the Pitjantjatjara lands, drafted in 1977. To outsiders, it looked like a simple outline of desert and mountains, but each curve of the rivers matched creation stories. Each boundary traced the footsteps of ancestral beings. Where colonial maps had marked the area as wasteland, the new maps revealed networks of ceremonial trails and hidden springs. The act was revolutionary. For the first time, a Western court recognized these maps as legal evidence, overturning 2 centuries of land theft. A group of elders holding painted bark maps had done what armies couldn't. They'd outmaneuvered an empire with geography. This wasn't just happening in Australia. In the Amazon, the Yanomami people sketched countermaps, showing how colonial borders sliced through their ancestral hunting grounds. Their versions included spirit paths and medicinal plant groves invisible on government surveys. When presented to Brazilian officials, these maps forced a reckoning. How could you deny land rights when the very geography proved deep connection? Meanwhile, in Canada, Inuit communities began overwriting colonial place names on official maps. A bay labeled Frobisher by British explorers reverted to its original Inuktitut name, Tassayujak, meaning resembling a lake. Each restored name was a pinprick in the empire's paper shield. The most powerful counter-maps weaponized silence. The Zuni tribe's 1982 reservation map deliberately left off uranium mines drilled by the U.S. government, instead highlighting contaminated springs with symbols meaning water that kills. When activists smuggled these maps to Congress, they exposed how official charts had hidden environmental racism behind neat contour lines. Similarly, Maori cartographers in New Zealand created protest maps with blank spaces where British forts once stood, visually severing colonial landmarks from the land's memory. What made these maps so threatening wasn't their accuracy, it was their audacity to redefine what a map could be. Colonial cartography had always been about possession, lines dividing mine from yours, ink staining land into property. But Indigenous maps spoke of reciprocity, showing how people belonged to the land rather than owning it. When a Navajo cartographer drew sacred mountains larger than scale allowed, or a Sami artist depicted reindeer migration routes as pulsing veins rather than dotted lines, they weren't making errors. They were refusing to play by the empire's rules. Today, these counter-maps are rewriting history in real time. In Alaska, Yupik fishermen use GPS to document traditional ice fishing holes that state maps ignore, forcing climate scientists to admit their models are incomplete. In Kenya, Samburu herders overlay Google Earth with hand-drawn drought refuge zones, creating hybrid maps that save both cattle and ecosystems. The tools have changed, but the rebellion remains the same. Every time a stolen name is restored, or a sacred site pulled from the shadows, it proves that maps don't just reflect power, they can redistribute it. The irony is delicious. For centuries, empires used maps to vanish entire cultures. Now, those same cultures are using maps to reappear. And with each rediscovered border, each resurrected name, the parchment of history grows a little more honest. Because the land never forgot the truth, it just waited for the right people to pick up the pen. Satellites circling the globe were supposed to usher in an age of perfect maps, no more phantom islands, no more dragons in the margins. But the moment NASA launched its first Earth-observing satellites, intelligence agencies realized something startling. The truth could be just as dangerous in the wrong hands. Today, while your phone's GPS can guide you to a coffee shop with meter precision, entire military bases vanish from public maps with a keystroke. North Korea's missile silos blur into pixelated smudges on Google Earth. China's artificial islands in the South China Sea appear 3 times larger on state-approved digital maps than they are in reality. The lies didn't disappear, they just upgraded their camouflage. Take the curious case of Russia's moving Crimea. After annexing the peninsula in 2014, Russian cartographers didn't just redraw borders, they altered time itself. Historical satellite imagery on Yandex maps suddenly showed Crimea always connected to Russia, with Soviet-era roads magically extending across what had been Ukrainian territory. Meanwhile, Ukrainian apps like Lyft began geofencing the region, refusing routes that acknowledged the occupation. 2 realities, 1 landmass, and millions of smartphones caught in the middle. But the most brazen tricks happen in plain sight. In 2019, Apple Maps briefly showed the entire city of Kyiv displaced by several miles, a glitch that just happened to coincide with Russian cyberattacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. Coincidence, perhaps, but when India's government mandated all GPS devices include an invisible error of up to 20 meters to confuse enemies, It proved even satellite precision could be weaponized. A delivery driver might not notice their pizza icon drifting, but a cruise missile certainly would. The real power move, controlling not just what's on the map, but when it updates. After the U.S. drone strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, mapping apps in Baghdad froze for hours, as if the city itself held its breath. Activists trying to document the blast site found streets mislabeled, intersections rotated digital fog of war. Similarly, during protests in Hong Kong, subway stations vanished from real-time transit maps, making it harder for demonstrators to regroup. Maps had become not just records of space, but tools to manipulate time and movement. Yet the most insidious lies aren't about hiding things, they're about inventing them. When Turkey's government released its new Blue Homeland maritime borders in 2019, the map extended its waters so far it overlapped Greece's coastline by 100 miles. The law of the sea, rewritten with a mouse click, Pakistan's national mapping agency quietly extends its Kashmir border eastward with each software update. These aren't mistakes, they're slow-motion cartographic land grabs, gambling that digital fiction will harden into fact through sheer repetition. The irony is delicious. After centuries of empires lying about uncharted territories, we now live in an age where every inch of the planet is photographed daily, and yet the deceptions grow bolder. The parchment has been replaced by petabytes, but the game remains the same. Whoever controls the map controls what we believe is possible. And as satellites watch silently from above, the real question isn't what they reveal, but who gets to decide what they hide. Iceland's mapmakers faced an impossible choice: keep the Danish place names imposed during centuries of colonial rule, or scrape them away like old paint to reveal the original Norse beneath. In 2019, the government voted to restore over 100 traditional names, from fjords to fishing villages, erasing labels like Danmarkshaven in favor of the Icelandic Herford. The decision sparked protests from descendants of Danish settlers who saw it as rewriting history. But for many Icelanders, it was the opposite, a long overdue correction to a lie inked onto their landscape. This wasn't just about spelling, it was about who controls the narrative of a nation's identity. Similar battles rage globally. In South Africa, activists have pressured Google Maps to replace colonial names like Pretoria with the indigenous Tshwane. New Zealand's government now requires official maps to use both Maori and English place names side by side. Even streets aren't safe. Cities from Bombay to Beijing have purged reminders of imperial rule from their signage. But here's the twist: every correction creates new distortions. When Alaska's Mount McKinley reverted to Denali in 2015, some Ohioans protested the erasure of their native son's legacy. Restoring one truth often buries another. The heart of the conflict lies in what we think maps are for. Modern cartographers swear by accuracy, measuring coastlines down to the millimeter, tagging every coffee shop. But historically, maps were never just fact sheets, they were arguments. When Britain renamed Bombay as Mumbai on official maps in 1995, it wasn't admitting error, it was endorsing India's post-colonial identity. Today's debates reveal a deeper question. Should maps reflect the world as it is or as it should have been? Technology complicates the ethics. Digital maps can toggle between names with a slider, showing Berlin as Berlin to tourists but Berlino to Italians, or displaying Crimea as Russian or Ukrainian depending on your IP address. This feels like progress, but it risks turning truth into a buffet where everyone takes what they like. When Starbucks maps labeled Tibet as a separate country to please Chinese censors, it wasn't neutrality, it was profit-driven shape-shifting. Perhaps the real lesson lies in who's missing from these debates. When Danes and Icelanders argue over a fjord's name, who speaks for the Irish monks who lived there before either? As we scrub away colonial lies, we risk writing new myths over older, quieter ones. The next time you zoom in on a map, remember, every name is a battlefield, every border a scar. And the cartographer's most dangerous trick isn't the lies they tell, it's convincing us their version is the only one that matters. The next time you glance at a map, whether on your phone or a classroom wall, remember the medieval monks who sketched dragons at the edges of the known world. Their ink wasn't just decoration, it was a warning. Centuries later, we're still navigating the same treacherous waters, where lines on a map can spark wars or erase entire cultures. Consider Brexit's infamous campaign bus, emblazoned with a map claiming the UK sent £350 million a week to the EU. The figure was debunked, but the visual stuck, a modern-day Mapa Mundi distorting reality to fit a political fantasy. China's 9-dash line is another masterclass in cartographic gaslighting. First sketched onto maps in the 1940s, this looping boundary claims nearly the entire South China Sea, slicing through waters legally recognized as Vietnamese, Filipino, and Malaysian. The audacity isn't in the claim itself, but in how it weaponizes repetition. Print the line on enough passports, school atlases, and weather maps, and fiction hardens into fact. Sound familiar? It's the same trick medieval kings used when they labeled contested lands as uninhabited or here be monsters. The tools have digitized, but the playbook hasn't changed. Modern conflicts are increasingly fought with pixels instead of parchment. During the Crimean annexation, Russian state TV flashed maps showing historical boundaries that conveniently stretched to include the peninsula. Ukrainian hackers retaliated by flooding navigation apps with fake traffic jams near military bases, turning ways into a digital shield. Even Google Earth isn't neutral, its algorithms quietly adjust borders based on local laws, so a village in Kashmir might vanish or reappear depending on your IP address. These aren't glitches, they're the latest iteration of an ancient game. Control the map, control the story. The lesson isn't that maps lie, it's that they always have. From the Herford Mapa, Mundi's Jerusalem-centric world, you to gerrymandered voting districts that twist geography into political pretzels, every cartographer, medieval or modern, makes choices. What to include, what to omit, whose names get etched in bold and whose are scrubbed away. The next time you see a map, ask not just what it shows, but who benefits from that particular version of reality. Because the most dangerous lies aren't the ones we question, they're the ones we mistake for truth. Maps that lied didn't just shape empires, they rewired how we see the world. Think about it. Every time you glance at a subway map with simplified lines, or a weather app that exaggerates a storm's path, you're witnessing the same psychological tricks medieval cartographers used to bend reality. The Herford Mapa Mundi's dragons have simply traded their scales for pixels. Today's digital maps might not show phantom islands, but they still hide prisons, military bases, and entire neighborhoods behind algorithmic blur, proving that the urge to control perception didn't vanish with parchment and quills. Consider how Google Maps and Apple's flyover feature depict disputed territories. Zoom in on the West Bank, and settlements might appear as neutral gray blocks, stripped of political labels. Cruise over Crimea, and the borders shift depending on your device's location settings. These aren't glitches, they're diplomatic tightropes walked in code. When a Taiwanese user sees their homeland labeled one way and a Chinese user another, it's not technology being neutral, it's perpetuating two competing truths. Just like the 16th century Spanish and Portuguese maps that placed the same spice islands in different hemispheres, modern platforms are still drawing borders to please kings only now. The kings wear hoodies and hold shareholder meetings. Yet the most potent lies aren't about hiding things, they're about inventing them. Social media maps that cluster crime reports in minority neighborhoods, or real estate apps that redline areas as high risk, echo the same destructive creativity as those old charts labeling Africa empty or the Americas ripe for civilizing. The tools have changed, but the damage compounds the same way, one misleading label at a time until fiction hardens into policy. So what's the antidote? Start by reading maps like a detective, not a tourist. When you see blank spots, whether it's a missing indigenous village on a trail map or a blurred-out factory on satellite view, ask who benefits from that silence. When borders wiggle between apps, question why, and most importantly, seek out counter maps, indigenous land acknowledgements layered over city grids, community-sourced charts of pollution hotspots, even guerrilla cartographers who stick missing bike lanes onto Google Earth. Because the power of maps was never in their accuracy, it was in their audacity to declare what mattered. The next time you open a map, remember, you're not just looking at directions. You're holding a battlefield where ink and ideology still clash. The question is, whose truth are you holding? If this dive into cartographic deception made you see your GPS in a new light, smash that like button, subscribe for more untold stories of history's shadowy corners, and drop a comment below. What's the most glaring map lie you've spotted in your neighborhood? Let's keep peeling back the layers, because the first step to resisting manipulation is